Have you ever considered that the relentless pursuit of order and perfection might be the most direct path to the deepest darkness? Imagine being driven by a grand vision of an ideal world, deciding that the only way to achieve it is by controlling every detail, every thought, every choice, every breath of life. What would happen if this ambition became an overwhelming force, consuming everything in its path? Get ready to unravel the mind behind the imposing figure of Sauron, the Dark Lord, and discover how megalomania and obsession can become the most perilous forms of tyranny. What you're about to see will change how you view power and its consequences, and perhaps even a bit about human nature and the seduction of absolute control. In a time beyond memory, even before the known ages and the first whispers of Middle-earth's history, there existed beings of great power and wisdom, known as Mir. They were primordial spirits who helped shape the universe under the Creator's guidance, imbuing reality with the melodies of creation. Among them, one stood out for his uncompromising passion for organization and an incessant quest for harmony in its purest, most rigid form. His name was Mehran, a forging spirit and master of all things involving order and structure, especially in the creation of material objects. He skillfully worked with fire and metal, seeing in them the capacity to mold reality itself, impose patterns, and give form to what was chaotic. His environment was one of pure creation and discipline, where logic and efficiency were the highest virtues, almost an art form in themselves. He was a natural visionary, someone who fervently believed in the ability to improve the world, to make it more beautiful, more efficient, and more predictable through meticulous planning and direct intervention. His brilliant mind saw patterns where others saw only chaos, and his burning desire was to arrange these patterns into a perfect, controllable symphony without any dissonance. This initial psychological trait is absolutely crucial for understanding his fall and the abyss he would become: extreme perfectionism and a profound longing for control. Mehran saw imperfections in every corner of the world around him, in the uncontrollable nature, in the unpredictability of the seasons, and especially in the diversity of beings with their own wills and choices, which he considered chaotic and inefficient. He believed, with an almost religious certainty, that he possessed the knowledge and ability to correct all these flaws, to eliminate error and unpredictability. He didn't seek chaos. On the contrary, his initial goal was order in its purest form, without deviations, without surprises, without the freedom he saw as the root of all disorder. Psychology shows us that perfectionism, when taken to extremes, can become a driving force for intolerance to any deviation from the established ideal, an inflexible vision that doesn't allow for human fallibility or spontaneity. For Mehran, the freedom of others was an inherent risk, an uncontrollable and unpredictable element that could derail his vision of a better, perfectly orchestrated world. He didn't see himself as a tyrannical dominator, but as a benevolent architect of perfection, a cosmic engineer who needed to adjust every single piece for the vast system of the world to function flawlessly under his supervision. But there was something, a void in his own soul, an imperceptible crack in his relentless pursuit of order, a blind spot in his own idealized perfection. That would make him incredibly susceptible to a powerful and transformative influence, one that would completely distort his noble initial purposes and plunge him into darkness. The inflection point in Mehran's journey wasn't an explosive event or a sudden catastrophe that abruptly cast him into darkness. It was, in fact, a subtle and gradual seduction, almost imperceptible at its outset, which directly preyed upon his pre-existing inclination towards control and perfectionism. Melkor, one of the greatest among the primordial beings, had already succumbed to his own boundless ambition, seeking to shape the universe to his own will, but through brute domination, the creation of discord and annihilation. It was in this context that Mehran, drawn by the promise of unlimited power that would allow him to realize his vision of order on a grand scale, and, more importantly, in a totalitarian and unquestionable manner, began his transformation. Melkor didn't simply offer chaos. Instead, he offered the definitive tools to eliminate the imperfections and inefficiencies that Mehran so despised, to impose a structure that he secretly craved, a structure that left absolutely no room for the freedom and inherent disorder of existence. Melkor cleverly pinpointed Mehran's weakness, his inability to accept imperfection. Psychology would describe this moment as the onset of severe cognitive dissonance, an internal conflict where his initial beliefs about improvement through creation violently clashed with the reality that he was allying himself with an intrinsically destructive and corrupting force. However, Mehran, with his mind already prone to rationalization, managed to justify this partnership, viewing it as a pragmatic and necessary means to achieve his ultimate goal of absolute order and control. For him, Melkor's vision, though brutal and focused on domination, promised an efficient and definitive way to eliminate the unpredictability and inefficiency that so bothered him in the world. The internal conflict, if it truly existed in its fullness, was quickly suppressed and suffocated by the increasingly strong belief that the ends, his vision of a perfect world, absolutely justified all means, a dangerous rationalization that corroded his integrity and separated him from his primordial essence as a being of light. Externally, he began to distance himself from others of his kind, becoming more isolated, secretive, and obsessively focused on his own designs. His transformation wasn't an impulsive act, but a gradual and calculated transition, where every choice, every concession to Melkor's impulses, no matter how small, drew him further from his original essence as a harmonious creator and inexorably closer to an implacable dominator. The science of psychology could explain this shift as a classic case of selective dehumanization and the justification of harmful acts through a distorted ideology. As Mehran saw more and more imperfections in other beings and in the autonomy of their choices, he began to diminish the value of their freedom and individuality, seeing them not as beings with inherent dignity, but as mere pieces on his grand chessboard of control, needing to be adjusted, even if by force and against their will. The thin line between the pursuit of order and tyranny became increasingly blurred, until it completely disappeared under the shadow of his unchecked ambition. And it was there, at that gradual and subtle turning point, that everything began to unravel, not just for Mehran, but for the destiny of all Middle-earth, which would keenly feel the overwhelming weight of his choice and the consequences of his new nature. Mehran's mind, now completely absorbed and corrupted by the relentless pursuit of control and power, and having already adopted the dreaded name of Sauron, the abhorred and horrible, began to mold itself in a distorted way, yet with a chillingly coherent and implacable internal logic. With each step of his ascent, his vision of the greater good grew darker, transforming into an obsession with total dominion and an enforced uniformity over all living things. The signs of his new way of thinking were evident in his actions and his manipulative rhetoric. He no longer sought genuine cooperation or persuasion based on common welfare. He sought subjugation through fear, force, and the complete annihilation of others' will. His cunning and ability to manipulate were impressive, convincing other beings and even entire civilizations to join his cause with the promise of a more organized, more efficient world, and, above all, one under his sole and unquestionable authority. For Sauron, freedom was the antithesis of the order he so desperately sought. It was a dangerous illusion that led to disharmony, unpredictability, and, ultimately, to unacceptable chaos. The only solution for a perfect world, according to his twisted logic, was to impose an iron-fisted and totalitarian order, dictated exclusively by him, leaving no room for any deviation or resistance. To truly penetrate this mind, we can use the analogy of a brilliant architect who becomes obsessed with his own creation. Instead of building a welcoming and functional home for everyone, he decides that his work must be the only one in the world, and that all inhabitants must live under his inflexible rules within his oppressive walls, without any choice or autonomy. Sauron genuinely believed, in his distorted heart, that he was saving Middle-earth from the inherent disorder of freedom. He viewed resistance as stubborn ignorance or meaningless rebellion, and autonomy as a fundamental flaw that needed to be crushed for the greater good, a good that only he could define. His logic was that of a perfect and self-sustaining system, where every element had its predetermined place and function, leaving no room for spontaneity, creativity, individuality, or organic evolution. Diversity was seen as an intrinsic flaw to be corrected, an anomaly, while uniformity, obedience, and total efficiency were supreme virtues to be imposed. This phase of his evolution can be analyzed through the concept of pathological narcissism combined with grandiose ideas of reference and delusions of control. Sauron believed, without any shadow of a doubt, that his vision was the only correct one, the only true one, and the only truly beneficial one for the world, and that the entire universe should revolve around it, adapting to his designs. Any opposition, any dissenting voice, any hint of resistance was seen as a personal affront to his genius, his wisdom, and his self-proclaimed greater good, rather than a valid perspective to be considered. He didn't see adversaries with rights or reasons to exist outside of his will, but mere obstacles to be removed, pieces to be repositioned, or completely broken in his vast and merciless game of power. It was a cold calculation, an engineering of domination where every step was meticulously planned to eliminate any trace of autonomy, and thus solidify his absolute control. But the true project of domination, the consolidation of his power, and the complete materialization of his tyranny was still dormant, waiting for the exact moment to reveal themselves in their full scope, with a central piece that would change the game forever. The act of ultimate transgression, the definitive point of no return for Sauron, which would irrevocably seal his destiny and that of Middle-earth, was the creation of the One Ring. This was not just an artifact of unimaginable power. It was the physical manifestation and the culmination of his pathological obsession with absolute control and an artificial order imposed upon everything and everyone. By forging this ring in the fires of Mount Doom, in the volcanic heart of Mordor, he not only imprisoned a portion of his own vital force and magical essence, but also an indissoluble fragment of his soul, imbuing the object with the very substance of his tyranny, his dominating will, and his desire to crush freedom. It was his distorted, oppressive, and totalitarian vision of the world materialized in a single object, a tool to subjugate the will of all free beings in Middle-earth, connecting them to him, draining their autonomy, and transforming them into mere puppets devoid of their own will. He believed, with an unshakable and almost delusional conviction, that through the One Ring, he could finally establish the perfect order he so deeply craved, eliminating the imperfection of freedom, individual choice, and the diversity he so despised. His worldview shifted completely, solidifying into an absolute and unquestionable certainty, impervious to any external logic or empathy. There was no longer any room for negotiations, compromises, diplomacy, or any form of peaceful and respectful coexistence. Morality and ethics were completely distorted and redefined to serve exclusively his selfish purposes of domination. For Sauron, the greater good was not the flourishing of life or the autonomy of peoples. It was the complete and total submission of everyone to his will, the annihilation of any vestige of free will or independent thought. He rationalized his most brutal and genocidal actions as necessary and inevitable to bring about definitive peace and harmony, utterly ignoring and devaluing the immense suffering, environmental destruction, and suppression of life he caused. Freedom was, for him, the primary source of all chaos, unpredictability, and conflict, and total control, dictated by him and his ring, was the only solution for a perfect, organized world free from the bothersome resistance of free minds and hearts. It is at this crucial point that we can ask ourselves, in a profoundly unsettling way, what if he was right in his distorted and paranoid view that freedom, with its uncertainties, its conflicts, and its imperfections, inevitably leads to chaos? This is a question that leads us to a deep moral dilemma about the limits of power, intervention, and the self-determination of peoples. The temptation to impose a rigid order in the name of peace and security is a dangerous trap that history, both fictional and real, repeatedly shows us. Sauron firmly believed that his way was the only way to prevent disorder and self-destruction, and that the suffering caused was a fair price to pay for his distorted utopia of a world under his absolute dominion. The forging of the One Ring not only sealed his destiny as a merciless tyrant, but also the fate of many, making him the personification of the tyranny that would come to consume Middle-earth with unprecedented darkness. Delving deeper into Sauron's psychological makeup, we realize that his actions, however extreme, devastating, and seemingly evil, made a disturbing and consistent sense within his own twisted and self-justifying internal logic. He didn't act out of blind impulse, from a meaningless madness, or out of pure gratuitous cruelty. Far from it. He operated with a cold and methodical calculation, guided by an unshakable belief in his own intellectual and moral superiority, and in the imperative necessity of his absolute order. His distorted mind operated with a chillingly ruthless efficiency, utterly disregarding human emotions, individuality, cultures, and the intrinsic value of life itself in favor of a system he considered perfect, rational, and unchallengeable, where he was the sole thinking mind. To understand this way of thinking, we can turn to studies on authoritarianism and the psychology of domination, which explore the minds of tyrants and oppressive regimes. Individuals with high authoritarian traits tend to excessively value rigid hierarchy, imposed order from the top down, blind obedience, and unquestioning submission to authority, especially when that authority is themselves or those they consider their ideological superiors. They see the world in black and white terms, with little to no tolerance for ambiguity, diversity of thought, individuality, or dissent. Sauron fits this psychological profile perfectly. His mental rigidity and his fixation on his utopian, yet oppressive, ideal prevented him from conceiving any other form of existence than that dictated by his will. His vision was singular, totalitarian, and exclusionary, and any deviation was seen as a threat to his supreme harmony and the efficiency of his system. He couldn't conceive that strength lay in diversity, but rather in uniformity. We can draw comparisons with historical figures, or even other prominent fictional characters who, motivated by grandiose visions of control and the improvement of society or its systems, imposed oppressive and ultimately destructive regimes. The belief that one possesses the sole truth, the only solution to the world's problems, combined with the power to impose it at any cost, creates an incredibly dangerous and desolate path. Sauron viewed free peoples as disobedient, irresponsible children incapable of governing themselves with the efficiency and order he deemed necessary. He saw himself as the stern but benevolent father who would provide them with the structure and discipline they needed, even if that meant crushing their individuality, their culture, and their very essence. His pursuit of power wasn't merely out of personal vanity or a thirst for cruelty. It was rooted in a profound and twisted ideological conviction that he was the only one capable of correcting the world and saving it from itself, even if that salvation meant the annihilation of everything that free life represents. It wasn't purposeless madness. It was cold calculation, founded on a vision of what constituted good that was profoundly erroneous to anyone outside his own totalitarian and implacable mind. The legacy of Sauron's relentless pursuit of absolute control was a landscape of widespread desolation, Not just physical, with once green lands transformed into barren, gray wastes, but also spiritual and cultural. After his initial defeat in the Second Age, and, subsequently, in the Third Age, what remained was not the order and harmony he so desperately craved, but a world scarred by deep pain, by immeasurable loss, by wounds that would take centuries to heal, and by the vivid, traumatizing memory of his tyranny. Although physically weakened and hidden for centuries, his psychological influence, the persistent shadow of his project, and the latent power of the One Ring continue to loom over Middle-earth for millennia, shaping generations, inspiring fear, and, unfortunately, corrupting the hearts and minds of those who sought power. The peoples he attempted to subjugate were forced to unite in unprecedented ways, to find strength in adversity, to develop remarkable resilience, and to value their freedom even more, truly understanding its precious and high cost. We can discuss the long-term consequences of this mindset of absolute control and the systematic denial of others' autonomy. When an individual or a powerful entity believes they have the inalienable right to impose their will upon everyone else, the ramifications are profound, systemic, and catastrophic. Individual liberty is crushed, creativity is stifled, cultures are forcibly homogenized, and the very essence of autonomous existence is put at stake, leading to stagnation and, ultimately, to degradation and emptiness. Sauron's story leads us to a crucial philosophical reflection on power and its temptations. Who are we to judge what is best for another to the point of imposing our vision with such force and destruction, justifying the unspeakable in the name of a distorted ideal? Doesn't the beauty of the world, the richness of the human experience, reside precisely in its diversity, in the unpredictability of its forms, in the capacity for choice and self-determination of each individual and each people? Sauron's defeat was not just a military victory, a clash of armies. It was a triumph of hope over overwhelming despair, of individuality and diversity over oppressive uniformity, of life over the relentless desire for total control. However, the myth of Sauron and the temptation of absolute power, of imposing a perfect and totalitarian order, remains a timeless warning for all ages and all societies. After all, the seed of the desire for control, the arrogant belief that one knows what is best for everyone, can flourish in any heart, at any time, and in any society, given the right conditions to germinate and grow. The journey through Sauron's mind reveals an uncomfortable, yet essential, truth. Obsession with control, born from the pursuit of an ideal order, can transform into the most relentless and destructive form of tyranny. He believed that by imprisoning freedom and autonomy, he would ensure peace and perfection. But what he truly built was an empire of fear, oppression, and subjugation that nearly consumed the world. What grim reflection remains for us? Perhaps it's that true horror lies not only in explicit, bloodthirsty evil, but in the cold calculation of a mind convinced it's acting for the greater good, no matter the cost, without considering the incalculable human price of lost liberty. And what if true order, true harmony, lies in freedom itself, with all its challenges, imperfections, and the untamable beauty of spontaneity and choice that make us human? Ponder this, and the delicate, constant balance between necessary order and essential autonomy that defines our very existence.